I'm Kristin Turner. I am a DMV native. I have a background in law and have popped around a little bit across a few industries, but most recently, I have been working in the political space. I was Elizabeth Warren's National Director of Ballot Access and Voter Protection during our primary season, and currently I work in the vote by mail space for a few different clients, helping to make sure that people can request and receive their ballots and return their ballots all safely and soundly this year.
What are some of the most common ways that people can vote in the 2020 general election?
Even though it varies from state to state, there are still general buckets that represent ways that people can vote in most states. So one of the methods is called early voting. So basically, early voting is the act of voting before Election Day. That can either be in person or by mail. A lot of states allow you to do it. Sometimes it's the week before, sometimes it's just the days before, and sometimes they have multiple weeks before. So it really will depend on your state, but it definitely is an option that's available in multiple states. The second way is voting by mail. Voting by mail is essentially when someone receives their ballot via the mail, fills it out at home, and then returns it via mail as well, or sometimes people drop it off. Now, in voting by mail states, sometimes states will automatically send your ballots to you, but in other instances, some states might require you to actually send them a form first, requesting them to send it so they have something on file. So you definitely want to check in with your state to see if they will automatically be sending ballots out this year. Like here in DC, they will automatically be sending ballots, but in other states, you'll need to send a kind of like a request for a mail-in ballot, or sometimes it's a request for an absentee ballot, which leads me to my next bucket, which is absentee voting. Absentee voting, voting by mail are in a large part, though they have different names, the same thing. Sometimes why people use the term absentee voting is because it refers to a certain group or certain groups of people that have a very specific excuse as to why they can't physically go to the polls on Election Day. So this most often applies to people who live overseas, for example. It applies to people who are in the military. Often they might be stationed abroad. Sometimes it applies to elderly people who aren't able to physically come to the polls, or someone who has an illness that prevents them from also coming. Generally speaking, absentee voting and voting by mail are the same things. It just depends on your state which term they like to use and whether or not you have to have a formal excuse in order to be able to vote by mail.
What are the main things that people need to consider when planning to vote?
So this is a really good question, especially because people, I think, get very stressed when it comes to thinking about voting because they feel like there needs to be a real complicated, plan in place. But the truth is, you really only need to think about, 4-ish things when you're making a plan. And they're pretty standard. It's basically like making a plan to do any other activity. So it's important to know, what time and what day you're going to be able to go. So what, when you specifically can fit it into your schedule, if you need to take off work, if you're already off of work, if you have childcare, if you're going to take your kids with you, just the window when you want to go. The second thing you want to know is where you're going to go to vote. So the actual name of the site, whether it's an elementary school or a high school or something like that, and the address of the site. Usually it's somewhere in your neighborhood, and you should be able to go on to your local Board of Elections or County Board of Elections website to find out the exact location. The third thing you want to do is figure out how exactly you're going to get there. Will you walk? Will you drive? Will you take public transportation? Maybe you'll go with a friend. In other instances, you might want to also plan that you're, whether or not you'll be coming home from work or on your way to work, just kind of what the whole entire day will look like. So you already have a plan in your mind of how it will go. And the last thing you kind of want to think about is just what you'll need to take with you. In 2020, obviously we're in the middle of a pandemic, and so a mask is the first thing you want to make sure you take with you, just so you can be safe, especially if you're physically going to the polls on Election Day. The other thing is just a valid form of ID. Now, you're not always required to show ID when you vote. It really will depend on the state. However, in some states, they do require some sort of valid ID to show that you're a voter in the state and in that jurisdiction. And so it's important to have it on you just in case.
Okay. And if you had one piece of advice for voters on Election Day, what would it be?
My one piece of advice for voters on election day is to not leave without voting. What's also important to think about is that sometimes, say there's, an issue, which there shouldn't be, but sometimes there are. Say, you're in line and the polls close, or, someone's saying that you're not registered. Who knows what the case may be. But whatever the case is, make sure that you do not leave without voting. Now, when there are instances where someone's having a little bit of trouble at the polls, sometimes they'll tell you to vote a provisional ballot. A provisional ballot is basically, it's going to have the same information, but it's a safeguard to make sure that your vote is recorded. A decision between not voting and voting a provisional ballot, always choose the provisional ballot. That is true. And the only thing you need to think about, though, is that it is always best to vote a regular ballot. So try as hard as you can when you're at the polls to vote a regular ballot. And if you can't, for whatever reason, make sure you don't leave without voting on a provisional ballot.
On a personal level, not who are you voting for, but what are you voting for in this upcoming election?
Everything. I think that, we are at a true crossroads. And so at this election on November 3rd, and I'll be voting before by mail, but for the November 3rd election, I will be voting for the chance for us all to have a stake in putting this country back together. And, so I guess I'll be voting for some accountability and, putting people in office that are competent and, at least willing to recognize that there are so many other people who need to be brought into the conversation because we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. This is my favorite assignment for everyone to do, but luckily you already have a little bit of a cheat sheet if you've been paying attention. So everybody walking away from this video today should be sure to go home or stay home and make a plan. So make your plan to vote, write down, what time you're going, where you're going, what you'll need to bring, and how you're going to get there. And then share it with your friends and share it with your family and see what their voting plans are. Because at the end of the day, we need as much planning up front as possible to make sure that day of there are as few hiccups, as preventable as possible. So that is your homework, and I will turn it over to the CRB to kind of give you more information on that. Thank you guys so much for having me. I really love the work that you guys are doing. Thank you for doing it.